Hello, everybody, and welcome to the One Good Day podcast. My name is Jeff, and I'm going to be your host for today. We are joined by Katie O'Dunn. Katie, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Today's topic is going to be focused on OCD. We're going to be talking about how OCD can impact panic and anxiety. Katie, before we get started with today's topic, can you please introduce yourself, your specialty, as well as where people can find you online?
Yeah. My name is Katie O'Dunn. I am a lead advocate for the International OCD Foundation and speak often, pretty much everywhere I can, about OCD and about evidence based treatment to make sure folks know that they can, in fact, get help for OCD and move towards a beautiful life. I'm the founder of Faith and Mental Health Integrative Services, where I specialize in religious scrupulosity, not as a clinician, but as a chaplain, where I work alongside really care teams all over the world, helping separate what's faith from what's OCD in this particular subtype. I've spent pretty much all the time working there. You can find me on RevK Runs Beyond OCD on Instagram. You can also find me
Back up a second. Let's spell that because there's a lot of words and
on
letters in there.
RevK Runs Beyond OCD. So it's REVK runs like running beyond OCD. Um,
REV, the letter K, RUNS, Beyond OCD on
yes.
Instagram. Got it. Okay.
Yes. So you can find me there. You can find me pretty much all over the IOCDF website at iocdf.org. That's the International OCD Foundation. Or on my website at revkatieodunn.com.
And that's REVKATIEODUNNE.com.
Yep, that's it.
Perfect. All right. So, as always, we start every podcast talking about your personal relationship with panic and anxiety. Have you had these issues in your life, and how did you handle it?
Yeah. So OCD in particular has been a part of my journey since before I can remember. Really, actually, if I think back to when I was 8 years old, some of the earliest things I can remember were walking into my living room and feeling like I needed to touch things in a particular order to keep everyone in the world safe. I was an 8 year old who was very concerned that if I didn't do everything right, the sun was going to get too close to the earth and everyone was going to die. And it would be my fault as an 8 year old kid. My parents at that point took me to my first psychologist who did not diagnose me with OCD or really know about OCD or know the effective treatments. We did a lot of talk therapy. And because at the time I had this level of anxiety, in part that we would call moral scrupulosity, where I was really, really concerned about the well being of others, I actually pretended to get better as an 8 year old because I didn't want my psychologist to lose his job. I thought, well, if I don't get better, people are going to think he's not doing a good job. And I just need to pretend that my symptoms are gone. So I did. And I continued to move through my life with OCD. And it manifests in so many different ways. OCD latches on to the things that are the most important to a sufferer and comes in the form of intrusive thoughts and either mental or physical compulsions. For me, that took the form of being fearful that I was a harmful person or that something bad would happen and it would be my fault. And most of my life through high school and into college was really overtaken by some pretty intense rituals. By the time I hit grad school, I was really, really good at keeping these rituals a secret. For me, a lot of that looked like checking the oven, the stoves, and locks. It looked like checking papers, going back and re listening to conversations I'd recorded to make sure I didn't say anything offensive. But kind of getting into grad school in my early 20s, it started to really, really take over my life. And I got to the point where I was no longer sleeping most nights because I was getting up and spending 8 hours checking everything in my building to make sure it was safe. I was in seminary at the time at Emory and was driving back to internship sites to make sure doors were locked, candles were blown out, things were unplugged. And at the time, I had an inkling that I might be navigating obsessive compulsive disorder. I was doing a lot of crossover with psychology courses and had this hunch and shared with a mentor that I thought I might be navigating OCD, and had the really horrific response in retrospect that I talk about often, where I was told that I shouldn't get treatment because I was pursuing ministry, because I was going through psych evaluations. I was told getting treatment will kind of mess up your future and your career. So I shoved it down. I didn't get treatment. I pretended I didn't have anything wrong, and I continued to get sicker. At this point, still really no one knew. And I took on my first kind of major role as the interfaith chaplain at the biggest private school in the continental US. So I was working with 2,700 awesome kiddos from different faith backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And there was a lot of pressure because I was coming in at age 25 as the first female in the role, and my predecessor had been there 25 years. OCD loves pressure. OCD loves to make it feel like we are going to do absolutely everything wrong. So intrusive thoughts or obsessions started to plague every aspect of what I did with my students. Every speech that I was making, everything that I was teaching, every class that I was working with, intrusive thoughts ran through my mind just over and over again about, what if I'm a bad person? What if I'm dangerous? What if I did something harmful and forgot about it? And my whole life got taken over really by compulsions, both physical and mental. We'll get into more of what OCD looks like, but what I do want to say is, it ultimately really attached to some tough parts of my life where I was working on with grief and trauma with kids. And in the midst of some losses, OCD latched onto that and very much blamed me for bad things that were happening in the world. I hit rock bottom, and ultimately, my life was very much saved by evidence based treatment. We'll talk about exposure and response prevention. I know a little bit more today. But coming out of that experience, I felt like I had an obligation to start to share my story in the community for the students that I was working with. I was working with a lot of students who had OCD, who were struggling with anxiety, panic, or other disorders where they felt like they couldn't be open about it, whether it was within their faith communities or cultural communities or within their friend groups. And I felt like I had an obligation to start sharing about the fact that actually me as their school chaplain went through treatment and came out the other side and was able to reclaim her life. So I started sharing about that, and the opposite of everything that I thought happened. I started to hear from families saying, oh, we can actually tell you about what's going on in our life. Can you help get our child in with evidence-based treatment? And that essentially propelled me to do a lot of work with the International OCD Foundation, to go back to do doctoral work related to OCD, and to really devote my life to making sure that folks didn't, like I did, wait 20 years to get treatment and have to hit rock bottom in order to find something where they could actually reclaim their lives and live in a value-driven way.
Wow, that is quite a story, and thank you very much for sharing that. And we're gonna dive right in now, and talk about what OCD is versus the general perception of being obsessed, or really into something.
So OCD, it is so stigmatized. It is so misused in the media, and I know within the community for us, it is just kind of a knife to the gut every single time we see someone on TV who is enjoying doing something related to organization, or when it feels like, oh, well, someone's really obsessed with something that they like, so they must have OCD. That isn't what it is. OCD is a debilitating disorder defined by obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are unwanted, intrusive thoughts. Typically, with OCD, those are intrusive thoughts that relate to something that is the most important to the sufferer. Where for some individuals, yes, that can relate to contamination, it can relate to organization, but it is always ego dystonic, which means it's something that directly opposes their values. It is not something that they like. It is not something that they enjoy. It is something that they want to get rid of those thoughts and those experiences. Some of the
So
most, yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, can you walk us through a few ways that it presents itself? I personally have been diagnosed with OCD, and obviously my checking behaviors are completely different than yours.
Yeah.
For obviously you had safety checking behaviors of the outside world. I have safety checking behaviors of my body. So I take my pulse, my oxygen, my temperature, I have more medical devices in my house than a doctor's office as far as like checking myself. So that is where like my OCD presents itself. So can you walk through just some ways that
Yeah.
that it does?
Yeah, absolutely. And yours actually relates in many ways to my fiance, as his relates to actually health and internal kind of components and making sure that he is safe internally. For so some of the general subtypes or common subtypes that we see are harm OCD, where an individual might worry that they are harmful or dangerous, and compulsions around that might be going back and checking to make sure they didn't do anything wrong. It might be fear of holding knives or fear of holding difficult objects, fear of being around loved ones because they're afraid that they're going to harm them. That's how compulsions might show up. There might be over responsibility related things, particularly related to moral scrupulosity. That's where I tend to fall. Of the compulsions are checking everything under the sun to make sure that everything is safe. It might be continuing to ruminate to make sure that you have done everything in appropriate ways. There are some people who have obsessions specific to their kids where they're worried, well, what if I'm a bad parent? And compulsions even might mean staying away from their child, feeling like they can't get close to them because they might be harmful in some way. There are sometimes religious obsessions where an individual feels like they have to engage in their religious practices in a really, really devout manner because they're afraid if they don't, that something horrible might happen. There's health related and contamination related OCD, where the fear is, well, what if something horrible happens to me, or what if I'm not safe, what if I'm not healthy, where compulsions can take on any form. It might relate to checking internally bodily functions, it might relate to checking temperature, it might relate to checking food. So the thing that I think folks are probably hearing is there's always the what if, which whatever it is that intrusive thought, it's that obsession, and then there's that compulsion. There's something, whether it's internal or external, in order to alleviate the fear, the doubt, the guilt, the anxiety that's coming up because of that scary what if.
Yeah, and I know that I am very good at what if. So speaking of the anxiety, let's talk about how OCD might intersect with anxiety and panic. How are they interconnected? I know from my personal example, I start to feel feelings of anxiety. My heart rate accelerates, my breathing accelerates. And it's like, that doesn't calm down for me until I go through my checking behaviors, and then my anxiety subsides. And we go through these like vicious cycles of this kind of thing. So, how is OCD intersecting with anxiety?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. For a really long time, OCD was characterized as an anxiety disorder, and it wasn't until recently that it was separated in the DSM. And anxiety is still really a characteristic of OCD, where someone experiences a lot of anxiety and fear and guilt and shame when those intrusive thoughts come up. But I think it's often really important to separate generalized anxiety disorder from OCD, where with GAD, the fears tend to be more rooted in reality, where often the fears with OCD are a little bit less realistic. And there can be this separation there. Anxiety, often we're thinking too with GAD about excessive worry, sometimes without the compulsion component, where OCD is really derived from this idea that we have to do something right now in this moment in order to alleviate all of those fears, that anxiety, that guilt that's coming up. I like what you noted with the anxiety that's kind of coming up for folks with OCD, that it feels like, and it might feel a little bit different for each person, but it feels really intense. It feels incredibly, I always say, when someone gets an intrusive thought or when they're having an OCD episode, they feel like there's a bear standing in front of their face. It feels like your palms are sweating. It feels like you're shaking. It just feels like it's absolutely terrifying, and something has to be addressed right now in this moment. Sweaty palms, rapid heartbeat, racing thoughts, dizziness, all of this. And that's really what drives someone, those feelings of anxiety, to perform these compulsions, to continue to do that over and over again because it feels so scary and feels so real and feels like if you don't, something horrible might happen.
And the opposite, that when you do that, it makes it better. I mean, that's the whole problem with, it's like you get that reassurance from doing the behavior, and then you're like, oh, we just solved the problem, but the only thing that you just did was put a band-aid on it for the next few hours, day, 2 days, whatever it is, until those feelings come back. And then it's almost like an addiction where you have to feed it.
Totally.
And because if you don't, you go through withdrawal. And then the only way to get that feeling of withdrawal to go away is to feed it with your compulsions.
And I love that you said that. So I always talk about, especially when I work with kids, that OCD only eats one thing. Like the only way we make OCD bigger is with compulsions. It eats compulsions for breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert, snacks. And the reason that we engage in compulsions is they do initially work. Initially, it makes us feel better. Like you said, that anxiety goes down, but it's just a band aid. And every time you engage in a compulsion, the next time OCD needs a little bit more and a little bit more in order for that anxiety to decrease. And that's how we get from someone initially, like when we think of more like checking behaviors, checking a door once to checking it 529 times, because that first time they felt better. And similar to an addiction, we're always kind of looking for that same relief that happened that first time, but it takes more and more and more. And eventually, the more that we're giving into OCD, compulsions take over our life, and we can never find the certainty that we're seeking.
Yeah, and we'll get into what you recommend for easing that in a little bit here, but I still want to go through some of the basic mechanics of this. So obviously, other than some of the racing heartbeat, sweaty palms, that kind of stuff, what are the other typical signs and symptoms of OCD?
Yeah. So OCD, the two biggest pieces again are the presentation or the presence of obsessions and compulsions. And when we get to a certain point, we'd often use a Y box to kind of determine where someone is on the scale. But when we get to a certain point where it's beginning to take over someone's life, that's when it really gets classified as a disorder. So
And
if you are
what's
spending,
a Y box before you go any
yeah,
further?
it's the Yale-Brown Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder scale, where a clinician would go through and rank with an individual how often throughout the day, how many hours they're spending engaging in, where they're noticing their obsessions, versus how much time they're spending engaging with compulsions. And it's ranked on a scale to actually determine where you are from a clinical perspective with OCD.
Okay.
And OCD, it's really interesting because I described the feelings that come up, but we always say with OCD, it's actually less about those specific feelings, and it's more about the presence or how often you're noticing those obsessions and engaging in those compulsions. So everyone has intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts are just thoughts. We look at different things, we make associations. But for someone with OCD, they become hyper kind of focused on those intrusive thoughts and they begin to take over life, where they feel like they have to start engaging in those compulsions over and over and over again. We mentioned those anxiety symptoms that often come up with intrusive thoughts, but for someone with OCD, anxiety is actually just one component of it. Some of the things that I see on a daily basis are actually guilt, shame, disgust. Those are huge, where someone feels like I have to do these compulsions because this feeling of guilt or disgust in my gut is the worst feeling that I've ever experienced. And if I don't do this compulsion, I will just not be able to handle it. So, a lot of times we'll say that they are kind of icky feelings that come up, which aren't necessarily just in the form of anxiety, but again, can be guilt, shame, disgust, anything else that come up alongside these intrusive thoughts that drive someone to engage in compulsions. Those compulsions are really kind of what feeds and drives the disorder, and those can be very physical. Those could be checking behaviors. It might be asking someone for reassurance. It might be going to look at something. It might be going and looking at. I know I have a lot of folks that will take pictures of particular things they're doing to go back and look later. But The sneaky compulsions that a lot of folks really keep them in the loop of OCD are mental compulsions, whether those are rumination or mental review, going back again and again in our minds to make sure that everything is safe. And those are really the components that drive OCD and that define an OCD diagnosis of how much time someone is spending engaging in those compulsions.
Okay. So let's talk about misconceptions about OCD. Which ones do you think potentially need to be addressed, particularly for people who may not understand the symptoms around OCD?
Yeah. A big misconception is one that folks like the things that they're doing as a part of OCD, that folks want to be neat, that they want to be organized, they want to be clean. One, OCD does not just relate to cleaning or organization. And when it does, it's not something that someone enjoys. OCD is always ego dystonic, it opposes the person's values. So that's a huge misconception. I think the second one that's come up a lot in the last year is that OCD is in some way helpful. It is not remotely helpful. There have been so many articles that I've seen this year that my head just explodes about OCD being some superpower. And it is not a superpower
No.
in any way, shape, or form. It's actually, I always say the superheroes are the awesome individuals with OCD who are navigating this debilitating disorder, who actually get to use their superpowers after they get treatment, because the disorder is hindering every aspect of their life. It's not helpful in school. It's not helpful in work. It's not helpful in anything you're doing. It's actually taking away everything that's meaningful and important to someone. And I see you chuckling, so I think you
Yeah.
probably heard the
I,
superhero thing too.
yeah. I wish that I could turn this into some sort of superhero power, but yeah, it's impacted a lot of aspects of my life over the last 20 years, and so it's definitely something that I haven't found to be helpful. I mean, for me, anytime I get any kind of small twinge feeling, anything that's out of the ordinary, my brain immediately goes to, okay, what's wrong, and how are we got to now run through our checklist of things to make sure that we're okay, and make this feeling just a feeling versus something that's catastrophic. So it has served me no good purpose in life.
No, and
Um,
I mean, and just to go off of that, it's I've had so many arguments, and I don't like to argue with folks, but I really want folks to know it is not helpful. It is harmful, and yet the treatment that we're going to talk about, I think folks can learn so much from and can step forward in big, beautiful, awesome ways. So it doesn't mean, oh, I have OCD and I can never do anything in my life, but it means, wow, by engaging in evidence based treatment, you get to reclaim your life from this really, really tough disorder.
yeah, it's definitely something I'm looking forward to talking about, and so let's dive right into it. What is evidence-based treatment, and why is it one of the most effective ways for helping somebody with OCD?
Yeah. So the kind of first line gold standard treatment for OCD is exposure and response prevention, which falls under the umbrella of CBT. And
And
exposure and response prevention,
explain for those that don't know what CBT is.
sorry, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
And just one sentence about what cognitive behavioral therapy is if somebody doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, so something where you're addressing both your thinking and your behaviors as a part of what it is that you're doing in treatment.
Okay.
Um, and exposure and response prevention is a very specific type where you are addressing both your obsessions and your compulsions. And it has two parts: ERP, so exposure, and then response prevention. The exposure part is actually having someone face their fears, is having someone lean into everything that is really, really scary for them. That might mean, like when we talked about the harm component, that someone, and this sounds really terrifying, but that someone might be holding a knife because that's really scary. It might mean that someone who is afraid of contamination is faced with something that is considered to be unclean. It might mean that someone who is fearful of leaving the stove on is asked to actually not check it and to leave their house and all of those things. So there's this exposure component of being faced with the things that you're the most afraid of and actually inviting that anxiety, that guilt, that shame, that disgust, whatever those feelings are that come up. The second part is really the most important. It's the response prevention. It's once all of those really scary things come up with the exposure, it's you are not engaging in any rituals. You're asking the person to not engage in anything physical or mental that is going to alleviate that anxiety, that fear, that distress. And what ends up happening is someone over time habituates where they can sit with those distressing feelings without having to do compulsions in order to alleviate that suffering. They're no longer getting into that compulsive loop where I have to check the door, 237 times. There's this embrace of, ugh, there's these really hard feelings that are coming up, but I'm able to sit with those. So ERP is never about getting rid of intrusive thoughts. It's about this practice over and over again of bringing up something scary so that we can practice sitting with the intrusive thoughts while not engaging in the compulsive behavior, while not engaging in something to alleviate that distress. I'm happy to answer questions, but I do want to note for folks, I know it sounds scary. And every time I describe it for the first time, I have folks say, wait, what? You're going to ask me to sit with my greatest fears and not engage in rituals? And it sounds really terrifying. But by working with a specialist, this is typically done on a hierarchy. So you start with really low level exposures and work your way up. And it's never about actually putting you in a position of danger. It's about letting your brain know that there is some faulty firing going on so that you don't have to respond to those signals that are going off for reasons that they don't need to be.
And it's a desensitization. In its simplest form, you're desensitizing yourself to these to help retrain your brain to think that this is not dangerous or this is not something that you have to do in order to save the world or feel healthy or feel safe, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Can you walk us through what a typical ERP session might look like for someone?
Yeah. So there's a couple different forms that this can take. There for some individuals, and actually engaging in ERP with a licensed professional. I always say it can actually be really fun because you sometimes go on field trips where you might actually go out into the real world and do something with your therapist that is really, really challenging, which
Yeah.
might mean going to a park and touching something that is contaminated and sitting with those feelings that come up alongside the clinician, saying, I'm going to sit with all of this fear. I'm going to sit with all of this anxiety that's emerging.
Yeah.
And ERPs, yeah, oh,
I
yeah,
did I
sorry.
did it last night, literally last night with my therapist. One of the biggest fears for me is being in situations that I can't control and can't get out of.
Yeah,
And, so that involves sitting in a car on a highway where there's no exit and I'm not driving. So literally I met with my therapist and he got in the car and we got on the highway and then I have to sit there and work my way through it. I mean, it's to me we're trying to lead up to a bigger thing of flying on an airplane.
that's
um,
huge.
that's to me, uh, it's a situation where you can't go through your checking behaviors and you can't get yourself calmed down. There's no way out, there's no exit, there's no nothing. So to me it's like the ultimate in lack of control because I just have to sit there and whatever the situation is going to be is going to be. So that's what we're building up to. So yeah, anecdotally, there are therapists out there who will go out with you into the real world and help you desensitize to some of this stuff.
How did I'm curious, even for folks to hear, how did doing that and being asked to not engage in compulsive behavior feel? How did the response prevention component feel with that?
I mean, for me, my my stuff manifests itself in physical sensations. So it's like I get sensations that I can't breathe. That's how my anxiety from not being able to engage in this stuff manifests itself. So you have to sit there and breathe through it and talk through it and you know but you just have to do it. And sometimes it's to me it's terrifying. Like I have like those types of situations and interactions are like a 2 or a 3 on the level, so I don't know how we're going to make the jump. Like, to me, there is no logical transition to going from there, where if we need to pull over we can, versus an airplane where I can't say to the captain, like, excuse me, I'd like to get off now because I'm very uncomfortable. Like, with all the other situations, there's always a way out, and there's an eject button, so to speak, if it gets too uncomfortable and too real. So I am terrified of when you have to make that final step into, because I think it's going to be more of a big leap than a final step. So that's some of the things that I'm trying to deal with.
You're a rock star, because I know it's so freaking hard. And I remember in my own journey being there with certain things and feeling like, how in the world am I ever going to get to this next step? Like it literally, I mean, what I said before, it feels like that you're being asked to keep a bear in front of your face or stand in the middle of the road and not get out when a semi is like darting at you. It feels so terrifying, and yet you're doing it. And I really do believe like you're going to get there with the plane. I'm working with someone now who actually is getting ready to fly for the first time, and you are going to get there. But it is just, I mean, you are so brave and awesome even to be doing that last night, because I think folks who are listening who might be going through this know it is scary. It is so
Yeah,
hard.
yeah. I mean, it's tough for me because it's like this is such a normal activity, and you just don't. I mean, going back to the whole thing about OCD being a superpower, it's like I don't want to fucking be driving with somebody on a Wednesday night, just randomly burning gas. Like, this is not what I want to be doing. I'd much rather be relaxing after a day of work and watching TV and hanging out and just doing something fun, versus putting myself in situations that aren't comfortable, and just trying to work my way through it so that the next time it comes up in my real life, that it's not a problem.
It is so tough, and I want folks to hear so worth it. And what we're describing right now are in vivo exposures. There's also imaginal exposures where you might not be leaving the office and you might be doing something with your clinician right in the office, because there might not be something that you can necessarily go out and do to work on that fear. And with that, the other type that we see a lot with ERP is scripting, where someone might write out a particular story of the worst imagined scenario happening, or record it on a loop tape and listen to that over and over again. In my own journey, I was scared that I was secretly a harmful, dangerous person that deserved to be in jail, and I just didn't know it yet. So my scripting was standing in front of a mirror for an hour at a time and saying, I may or may not be a horrible person. I may or may not deserve to be in jail. I may or may not have committed a crime last night and completely forgotten about it. And for that, it's really about embracing uncertainty, where OCD tells us we have to have 100% certainty that everything is safe, that everything's okay. The scripting is really about saying, I am willing to sit with all of the fear and anxiety that's coming up around this feared scenario, just like if I was out in the real world doing an exposure.
And speaking of things that you can do on your own, do you have any strategies for people that would want to walk through some of this stuff on their own, or things that people can do potentially in between sessions, to continue to make things better for themselves?
Yeah. So I have a couple of really great resources around this. I'm a big fan of, if folks are not able to do this with a clinician, some self help resources. The International OCD Foundation, we have a ton of just programming going on all week to help people. But Kimberly Quinlan, with Your Anxiety Toolkit, also has what's called CBT School. And those are self help resources where you can actually go through modules and practice exposures on your own. Um, Reed Wilson is another one who has a series of great self help resources. I can share in the show notes. I hosted a town hall a couple weeks ago, actually, on self help with all the big self help OCD folks, talking about the way that that looks. But being able to plug into those programs outside of treatment can be really, really great. But the biggest tool I would say is working on non-engagement responses, which I can go into to what that means
Yes, please.
between sessions. So a non-engagement response is something that you do so that you don't respond to the intrusive thought, so that you don't engage with it, whether that's in a physical or a mental way. A non-engagement response is anything where you're responding and you're being okay with uncertainty or with not knowing. I think of it as the act of leaving a courtroom, where often when we have an obsession, we get this idea of what if something horrible happens? And you immediately get into this mental battle of, well, do I need to do something to fix it? How do I alleviate that? A non-engagement response is you stepping out of the courtroom and no longer having that conversation. Some of the most popular ones are maybe, maybe not. It's literally just saying out loud, maybe that scary thing could happen, maybe not. Probably just OCD. I'm going to keep moving on with my day. Another one a lot of folks use, this is one of my favorites, is just acknowledging the anxiety. Like, that makes me really stressed out, but I'm going to keep moving forward anyway. I have some folks that just say, yep, that would suck, but sounds like OCD, and I'm going to keep stepping forward with my day.
So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily replacing it with another activity or another action, i.e., breathing exercise, or
Yeah.
like for me, when I get anxious, I sometimes like will rub textured things to help distract from things. So you're not talking about things like that, which is traditionally what's recommended for the anxiety part of things. It's more not giving it the power of replacing it with something else, because then that becomes your obsession or your behavior to
Yeah.
do that. It's more just acknowledging that it's there and continuing to try to move on with your day.
Yeah, and I love that you highlighted that, because it's actually one of the biggest kind of mistakes that folks make in treatment is this idea of, oh, if I just replace it with something else, we'll be great. And what we want to do is acknowledge it and let it be there while continuing to step forward with our values, which is a big component of acceptance and commitment therapy, which is used as an adjunct to ERP often. So you would use your non engagement response. You would say, yep, maybe, maybe not. That would really, really suck. And you don't try to get rid of the thought. You allow it to be there while continuing to move forward with your day. And to your point, when we try to get rid of it, it becomes very compulsive. And anytime we try not to think about something, it's actually why it comes on even stronger. Like if I sat here with you right now, Jeff, and was like, and said, don't think about a pink elephant. Please don't think about a pink elephant. Think about anything but a pink elephant. What are you thinking about?
Pink elephant.
Yeah. And it's the same with OCD. Anyone who's saying, man, I wish I could have any intrusive thought except this one, I want to get rid of it, it's going to come on 10 times stronger. So we take away its power by saying, cool, I don't care that it's there. Maybe, maybe not. I can still step forward right now with everything that I care about.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, it's like anything else with anxiety. The more you try to fight it, the worse it gets. And it's very similar here. So for those that let's walk through a couple of different phases of the process of OCD. For those that think they may have it, what type of therapist would you potentially recommend trying to seek out to get formally diagnosed and begin treatment? And then for those who know that they have it, what type of therapist would you recommend seeing to that be most effective for people with OCD to work their way through this?
Yeah. So this is such an important question. There is still on average, and I just checked the statistic because I was hoping that it decreased, but still on average, it takes someone 17 years from their time of onset to get an effective diagnosis and effective treatment for OCD, which is really ridiculous when you think about it. And when
So
you think about it, it's nuts. And for me, and so many I know, I shared a little bit about my story today, just a snippet, but nowhere near how debilitating it was. I think about my fiance who has OCD, and he got to the point where he was bedridden and he lost everything and didn't
wow.
get treatment for 35 years. I mean, it's crazy. So the reason I bring him up is he I guess I said didn't get treatment. He didn't get the effective treatment.
Hmm.
He was in talk therapy for
Yeah.
most of his life, and that's a lot of times I'll see folks with OCD who say, "Well, I've been with a talk therapist, or I've been with a hypnotherapist, or I've done another
Been
modality,"
done both of those.
and probably not with any
Oh,
success.
where I still have the issues that I have. So, I've gone through talk therapy, CBT, just regular CBT, which actually worked for me, but then my therapist decided to move, or I decided to move, one or the other. So I had to find a new therapist. I've done EMDR,
I was just going to say EMDR, I hear like every day.
which that's a whole nother ball of wax for me because my EMDR therapist isn't actually doing any EMDR. So that's a whole nother story in and of itself. But yeah, none of that stuff has worked for me. So it's finding the right therapist is such a key thing for people, and it really is trial and error, finding a good vibe with the person that you're working with, and feeling comfortable with how to proceed.
Yeah, and making sure it's an OCD specialist. I feel like I spend outside of my professional work most hours of my day advocating on social media, talking to folks who have been in the wrong treatment and trying to make sure that folks actually get with an OCD specialist. I can share for the show notes too. We have a great resource on the International OCD Foundation website that actually has a directory of all of the OCD specialists who are knowledgeable in ERP. It lists if they've been trained at the IOCDF's Behavioral Institute. It talks about specialties, but you can actually look through there and really find someone who's trained in exposure and response prevention who is licensed in your area. So I advocate for that. And then I also advocate for, all, of course, doing your homework. And when you get in with someone, it's not just about that therapist seeing if you're a good fit for them. It's very much you seeing if they're a good fit for you. And I always say, be really upfront and say, how many people have you treated with OCD? How much of your caseload is related to OCD? How do you define ERP? What would that look like for us? And I know a lot of folks with OCD also have some form of social anxiety and might feel like I can't ask these questions. I don't want them not to like me. I don't want them to think I'm a jerk. That is not what you're doing. You are making sure that you are actually getting in with someone who knows effective exposure and response prevention so that you can step towards your life, whether you're in the diagnosis process or further into the treatment process.
All right, and we may have just answered this question, but I always close with the same question. What is your best piece of advice for somebody dealing with panic and anxiety issues?
Yeah. So I think I always like to let folks know that, we talk about all of the ins and outs of how difficult all of these things can be. But I always like to close by acknowledging that there is so much hope. There is so much hope to continue to move towards your values, to continue to move towards the things most meaningful for you. And you absolutely deserve a big, beautiful, awesome life. And I really believe that with evidence based treatment, it is possible. My two phrases are stick with the ick, which folks hear me say all the time. It means let all the intrusive thoughts, all the scary stuff be there. While the second phrase is running towards your values, continuing to run and move towards everything that you care about. And I deeply believe that it is so possible wherever you are in your journey to allow the scary stuff to be there, to sit there in the midst of ERP, but also to reclaim your life and to move towards every single thing you care about. I'll close by saying if you asked me in 2018 or 2019, could I ever be in a place to talk about my OCD, to work in the area of OCD, to, oh my goodness, share my story? I would have said, absolutely not. I was so debilitated. And I am so grateful to be in a space I am today because of treatment. And I think that is possible for every single person, and that you all deserve to be in a space where you can enjoy your life.
Thank you so much, Katie. We really appreciate you joining us. You can find her on Instagram, RevKrunsBeyondOCD. And then her website is RevKatieODUNNE.com. It was a pleasure talking to you. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jeff.